Moin and guten Tag! With this step-by-step masterclass, you will know how to make a world-class, beautiful sandwich bread every time. The best thing about this recipe, it's fast and very easy to do. It's perfect for lazy people like me. All you need for this magic to happen is a loaf pan like this and a few hours of just waiting. I'm excited to show you because I have a few awesome hacks prepared that make this recipe one of my favorites. So bear with me as I'll show you step by step. I wanted to make sure that this recipe is not like other oversimplified recipes. I love to give you detailed explanations because that way you will be able to follow this recipe at home. Some people will tell you just mix this, boom, done, you have a bread. However, it's very likely that you have a different oven, you have different flour, you might have different yeast, so things are not going to work exactly the same way as the original developer of the recipe. That's why I always like to explain the why, and this is going to enable you to follow this recipe at home every time with a great success rate. Now, to make sure it's not getting too long, I also added chapters to this video. So when this German explanations gets too boring, you can always just skip ahead to the chapters that interest you. Also, when you want to rewatch this recipe, you can follow the chapters step by step. One more note, this is going to be part of a series. I'll be showing you 3 iterations of making sandwich bread. This is the most basic one with just yeast. The second one will be about using a Polish and awesome pre-ferment to add additional flavor. And the third one is going to be a sourdough-based version. Each episode is going to get a little bit more complex, but this is the basic one, the most simple one. I love making this recipe when I don't have enough time and I want to have a delicious sandwich bread very soon. Sorry, I had to do this. Being an engineer, I just love flowcharts. So here the full recipe one more time, step by step, and I'll be guiding you through all the steps and give you all the explanations that are needed for you to master the sandwich bread every time. Now, let's get started by making the dough. We will be mixing flour, water, salt, and yeast. So for this recipe, I'll be using 400 grams of flour. That exactly matches my loaf pan. That's something you have to look out for. Then 70% water equaling 280 grams, 2% salt equaling 8 grams, and 1% dry yeast or 3% fresh yeast equaling 4 grams of dry yeast or 12 grams of fresh yeast. Bakers always like to specify each quantity as a percentage based on the flour. This way they can easily bake multiple breads and just have to recalculate the other ingredients. The amount of water that you should be using for your flour depends on your flour. If you were to just follow a random value from the internet, chances are that your bread is going to be flat like a pancake. In general, the higher protein, the more water you can be using for your flour. I got you covered. I made a small table for this no-knead recipe. In this case, my flour has around 15% protein. That's why I'll be using more water for my flour. If you have less, then you should be adjusting this value accordingly. Good news, we are baking using a loaf pan. We're not using a Banneton proofing basket. For this loaf pan, we have additional support here on the edges. So the water amount is not that important, but it's still quite important, I'd say. This is a really crucial part of information that I missed at the start. I was always so excited following recipes and boom, pancake, 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 frisbee. But yeah, then I learned about this. And yeah, please have a look at this yourself. It's going to make your bread baking so much better right away. Now I'm just going to be stirring everything together until that I see that the dough has homogenized. Just use your hand and stir a little bit. I'm not trying to add any dough strength. I'm not trying to knead. I just want to make sure that everything holds together. And it's still a little bit crumbly right now. Nothing to worry. This typically takes around a minute. Note how I like to use the dough to actually remove some leftover parts of flour and dough from the edges of the container. Nothing goes to waste. And after around a minute, this is how the dough looks. Note how this is still tearing. This means the gluten did not develop at all. And to fix that, we could either be kneading more, but since this is a no-knead recipe, we want to be lazy. Just wait 15 minutes. Close this. That's why I like to use a pot, and then we'll be back and I'll be showing you what magic happened to this dough. This dough around 15 minutes later. wet your hands a little bit with cold water and have a look. This is called the window pane effect, and this is gluten, and this is perfect. This is pretty much what we are now trying to inflate with the yeast, and we got all that by being lazy and just waiting a little bit. It's time to take out the dough from the container real quick. With wetted hands, I'm just removing the dough, and then I'm placing it on my unfloured surface. Resist the urge to use additional flour. We need to use the stickiness of the surface to our advantage. Now comes my favorite hack. We will be extracting a small fermentation sample from the dough. Some recipes will tell you now wait 2 hours, now wait 4 hours, but that's never going to work out. Because based on your dough temperature, your kitchen temperature, and so on many other factors, this period is going to be different. Now by using this sample, by extracting a small piece of the dough and marking the jar, we will know exactly when our dough is done fermenting. And this makes baking so much easier. I extracted a small piece of the dough, just enough to cover this small container here. And this is going to tell you exactly when the dough is done with the fermentation. And the fermentation now started because we mixed in the yeast. The yeast is converting our dough into something delicious. And the fermentation is done the moment this sample here doubled in size. And this is just so much easier than following timings. This is going to make sure that every time you do this, you're going to nail it. Of course, you could also just eyeball the main dough if you wanted to, but I find this method to be much more reproducible, much simpler. And I'm just extracting as much as is required to cover the bottom of this jar, and then I'm using a small rubber band. Make sure that you have a container that is of cylindric shape. Now, if you don't want to do this, you can also just wait and eyeball this until this roughly doubled in size. Cover your sample. We don't want this to dry out. Now this dough still looks a little bit like a mess, and we don't want that. We want to round this dough up so that it looks nice and smooth. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I find a smooth dough very, very satisfying. And wet your hands one more time, and at a 45-degree angle, we will be pushing inside of the dough, and then we pull it over the surface. You see that this part always stays in the same location. And this way we're using the tension of the surface to our advantage and smoothen up, rounding up the dough. Very satisfying. And look how this blob of dough turns into a nice looking smooth dough ball. And then simply with one hand, take your dough and place it back in your container. Close it. That's why I like to use a pot. And now it's just going to stay in there until we see that this sample doubled in size, and then we proceed. In this case, roughly 2 hours later, my sample doubled in size, and that indicates to me that my dough is now done with the first stage of fermenting. Note how the dough increases even a little bit more than the doubling in size. This is totally okay for a yeast-based bread. For sourdough-based breads, we would run into a serious issue of over-fermentation. Now, if you don't have enough time, let's say you want your dough to be ready in 30 minutes, you could be using another hack. You could be using a little bit more yeast, a little bit of sugar, and then you're going to have a radioactive dough. Just an idea in case you're running out of time and you want the recipe to be done even faster. Now it's time to remove the dough from the container. With wetted hands, go around the dough. Don't worry if it collapses a little. All good. For yeast-based doughs, this is not really an issue because the dough is going to inflate again. Now it's no longer stuck at the bottom of the container, and with two hands you can take it and place it on your surface. We need to round this dough up right now because right now the surface is not in a nice shape to do the actual shaping. So the same thing we did before with wetted hand, push at a 45-degree angle and pull. Push and pull. And now we have a nice uniform piece of dough. Don't overdo it. Let this rest now until you see that this has increased in size again. This means the gluten is relaxed and shaping is so much easier. This is a really good thing to master. It's called pre-shaping, and you will also need this when you want to bake multiple loaves at the same time. Now we're ready to shape the dough. While this dough is resting, I'm already preparing my loaf pan. In this case, I'll be using some vegetable non-stick spray. This really does wonders. If you don't have a spray like this, consider using butter or olive oil. I got this tip when I met with a bread sommelier in Hamburg. Yes, bread sommeliers exist. And I was surprised to test this, because even after a few usages of this oil, I no longer had to use as much oil afterwards. So it seems it kind of creates a coating. And this really made my baking with loaf pans so much better. No more sticky doughs. For shaping, we will be flouring the surface now. We don't want the dough to stick to the surface. Just put a little bit of flour here on the surface. That should be enough. Now this dough is stuck to the surface because we didn't use any flour. With wetted hands, we will remove the dough and then flip it over that this side is here at the bottom. So 45-degree angle, push inside, and now I'm lifting it, and note how it doesn't stick because I have wetted hands. Then I place the dough here on this bed of flour. I'm just elongating the dough a little bit more, which gives me more surface area. Okay, wait a second, we need to talk about this. What is this in the middle inside my dough? I guess you saw it too. I just wanted to say I have no idea. If you have an idea, please let me know in the comments. Now, with one movement, I take the bottom side, fold it out, pull it out, and fold it here into the middle. I remove some of the excess flour. Now I want this side to be glued right here. This gives me a very strong dough. Now I pull this out and fold this over and tuck this down. Now this is like this in front of me, and we have one more step. I'm flouring my hands now because I don't want the dough to stick. I take the dough, put it into my direction with the seam here facing me. Now I take this side of the dough and pull it out. If it sticks too much, just place a little bit more flour on your hands. I pull this out and I fold this over. Note how I rolled this up right there. Now with floured thumbs, I push inside here and roll it upwards. My thumbs push inside. I can take them out because they're floured, and then I roll up the dough. And this creates a lot of tension. Now this is my almost ready-made dough. With two hands, I'm just sealing the edges here. Now, if you use too much flour, brush off that flour and use a little bit of water. It's going to do wonders. So some water, put some water here, and then just tuck the dough together like this. And now this is our beautiful sandwich bread. You can pull it over the surface a little bit more just to make sure it's nice and round. This only works if you didn't use that much flour. With a quick movement, I'm taking this dough and I'm placing it here inside of my loaf pan. No flour, just the oiled, or in this case, sprayed loaf pan. Now this is a moment where I screwed up a lot in the past. I was not clearly thinking, and then I just placed the dough in the loaf pan upside down, and this is not what you want to do. When using a loaf pan, you want the beautiful side to be on top. The not so smooth side from the bottom should stay at the bottom. Now if you screw up like me, nothing to worry. You can just take the dough out and then flip it over, and then the beautiful side is going to face you. You might have to add a little bit of additional oil to the loaf pan. This would be the moment where you would mop your dough and you could place some additional seeds on top if you like. But in this case, I don't want it. I just want to have a plain sandwich bread. Brush some additional flour only if you didn't add seeds here on top. We don't want the dough to stick now. After shaping, the proofing stage starts. Normally proofing is done inside of one of those Bennettons, but we will now be using the loaf pan. Some recipes will tell you now wait 30 minutes, now wait 60 minutes. Nope, that's never going to be perfect. You will never have the perfect bread. And here comes another favorite hack of mine. And this hack is done using your finger. And the hack is called the finger poke test. By poking into our dough, we know when the dough is done proofing. At the start, the dent that we put into the dough is going to recover relatively quickly. In the end, it's going to recover relatively slow, and that's when we want to bake the bread. This can take anywhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours. It depends a little bit on how much yeast you use, how warm the water was for the dough, so it's always going to be different. But the finger poke test, master this, and you will have the perfect proofing stage every time. And for this, make sure that your finger is floured and then push into the dough. And then you can see this springing back here. In around 30 seconds, this is going to be gone completely. You will also notice that the dough is not feeling as stiff anymore, as for instance when we initially put together all the ingredients. At the end of the proofing stage, it feels very, very fluffy. This is another example of an overproofed dough. The dent simply doesn't recover at all, and note how the dough also looks relatively sticky. Now for my buns, those are the buns before proofing and after proofing. Note how they significantly increased in size. And I know this sounds stupid, the finger poke test, but this is really the most reliable way to proof on time every time, and this works for almost all bread related recipes. So master this technique and you have become a better baker. Now when we see that this only very slowly springs back, this means that our dough has inflated enough and it's ready to be baked. I guess it's going to take around 30 to 60 minutes for this bread. And then it's ready to be baked. While I'm waiting, we don't want the dough to dry out. That's why I'm using a plastic bag in which I'll place the dough. This is also where the flour comes into play. If we didn't place flour here, then this might stick on the bread, and this is something we don't want. Around 45 minutes later, I'm repeating the finger poke test to see if the bread is done proofing. With floured hands, I poke into the dough and it feels much more fluffy. And the dent also does not recover as quick anymore. This bread is about ready to be baked. Now that my dough is done proofing, another great hack comes into play.
The freezer hack.
Before baking, we will be using a sharp knife, or in my case I'm using a razor blade, to do a small incision into the dough. By having this incision, the dough is going to spring through that incision upwards. If we wouldn't score our dough, we would have random cracks everywhere. And we want to have that beautiful oven spring, and that's why we have to score. Now the problem with scoring is, if you have a dough that is at room temperature, it's relatively hard to cut through the dough. By using the freezer for 30 minutes, we have a much stiffer dough and scoring is going to become so simple. Small side note, if you want to support me and have an awesome Batard shirt like this, check out the description. This is the dough before placing it in the freezer, and then 30 minutes later the surface temperature has significantly cooled down. Perfect for scoring. Give it a shot yourself, you will enjoy this. So, dough passes the finger poke test. I start preheating the oven to 230 degrees or 450 degrees Fahrenheit. You're welcome, Americans. And then I take the dough and place it in the freezer. So while the oven is preheating, my dough is inside of the freezer. I'm preheating for around 30 minutes. For baking, there are two options. I like this option. I have a bowl here at the bottom. This bottom needs to be able to resist high heat. Then I have a stone here. This could also just be another tray. On this tray, I will be placing the loaf pan. And then on top, in the end, I will be placing another tray here in the oven, and this is going to create a sauna because we need to have as much water as possible. Steam is really essential for the first stage of the bake. And then, once the dough is ready out of the freezer, I'll be pouring boiling water inside of here, and this is going to evaporate, creating a very steamy environment. The other option you could do, if you have the same loaf pan one more time, just place the other loaf pan on top, and then you'll be creating a very steamy environment as well, similar to a Dutch oven. I'll preheat everything like this in the oven. I'll opt for that option because you likely have this too. And this tray here won't be preheated. I'll be putting this in a little bit later. Now it's time to score the bread. And for the sandwich bread, you just want to be doing a cut here at the middle. It's important that you don't tear your dough that much. So a sharp razor blade really does wonders. So with a swift movement, I'm cutting around 1 to 1.5 centimeters deep into the dough. If you're not happy, you can just correct the cut a little more. And as I said before, steam is everything, so give your bread a good spritz with some water. Now for baking there are two options. There's the super soft sandwich bread and there's the one that has a little bit of a crust. I'll be opting for the super soft one. And for the super soft one, you want to bake all the time with steam. For the one with a little bit of a crust, you want to remove the steam after around 30 minutes. Now it's very hard to say when your bread is actually done because your loaf pan might have a different size than mine. A really reliable way to make sure that your bread is done baking every time is to use a thermometer. Measure the core temperature and your bread is done the moment the temperature reached 95 degrees Celsius or 200 degrees Fahrenheit. That brings us to the end of this video. Make sure to check out the next episode as well, where I'll be showing you how to use a poolish to make an even more awesome sandwich bread. A poolish just adds so much incredible taste to the dough. Troubleshooting or bread related questions, please drop a comment in the comment section. I'm happy to be of service and have a look at what you're writing. As always, happy baking and may the gluten be with you. I was always wondering, is it actually a loaf pan, loaf tin? What's the correct name?